The words were simple. The impact was devastating. A confession meant for one heart tore through an entire monarchy. And in the space of a single trembling breath, a future king shattered. Catherine's voice didn't rise. It didn't break. It barely carried through the quiet corridor where she finally released the truth she had been holding so tightly that her own pulse felt imprisoned beneath it. But whatever she whispered that day, whatever revelation slipped from her lips with the fragile honesty of a mother in pain, struck William with a force he had never prepared for, because no amount of royal training, no palace conditioning, no emotional armor reinforced since childhood could shield him from a truth about his children. And when that truth landed, something inside him collapsed. Not in public, not before cameras or courtiers or polished marble floors echoing with protocol. It collapsed inside his chest, where a boy who once watched another woman he loved break under pressure still lived quietly and painfully. And in that moment, one question formed and burned through every layer of the institution. What could Catherine have revealed that pierced the very core of a man raised never to show the world anything but strength? It did not take long for the emotional pressure to seep into the palace walls. Nobody saw the confession, but everyone felt its echo. The energy shifted silently, the way storms gather without thunder, only that dense, low hum that makes the air feel alert. Within the royal household, people didn't speak openly, but the tone of their whispers said more than any official statement ever could. Senior aides moved with sharper turns, pausing before entering rooms as if they were interrupting something delicate. Long-serving advisors exchanged glances that carried questions too risky to ask out loud. Even the staff, who were accustomed to the unpredictable rhythms of royal life, sensed that something had gone terribly wrong. Not wrong in the political sense, not a PR crisis or a policy misstep. Wrong in the deeply human way only families understand, the kind of wrongness that comes from pain you cannot hide no matter how well the walls of a palace are built. People noticed Catherine's disappearance from the usual routines before they understood why. She withdrew gently, quietly, as if trying not to disturb the air around her. She moved more protectively, with an awareness that came from carrying a weight she had held for too long. And William, usually composed, measured, and firmly centered, carried an invisible tremor around him, a shift so subtle that only those closest recognized it. His voice was softer in meetings, his replies delayed by thoughts clearly pulling him elsewhere. Those who had watched him grow since childhood recalled the last time he had carried such internal tension, the weeks following Diana's passing, when grief carved itself into him before he ever had a chance to understand it. That memory, buried yet never forgotten, flickered through the staff floors as they sensed history pressing against the present. Something unspoken was unfolding, and although the palace had weathered decades of scandals, tragedies, and crises, this felt different because this time the pressure wasn't from outside. It was coming from within the heart of the family itself. When Catherine finally chose to share the truth with William, she did so only after months of internal conflict. She had tried to manage the emotional struggle alone, believing that protecting her children also meant protecting William from the full weight of it. For a long time, she convinced herself she could shoulder it quietly, smoothing the rough edges of their inner turmoil, telling herself that children go through phases, that emotional storms pass, that the palace would only interfere if she spoke too openly. But mothers know when something is more than a phase. They know when pain is taking root. They know when silence is becoming harmful. And Catherine, who had spent years preserving an image of steady grace for the world, found her private fears growing into something she could no longer rationalize. She reached a breaking point, not the explosive kind, but the soft, exhausted unraveling of someone who has spent too long carrying too much. Her confession wasn't dramatic, and there was no sense of theatrics. It was the quiet release of a truth that demanded to be heard. One of the children was struggling emotionally in a way she could no longer manage alone. Not misbehaving, not acting out for attention, but genuinely struggling under pressures neither parent had wanted to impose. The palace's expectations, the institution's silent demands, the public's fascination, the burden of lineage, the fear of missteps. Catherine had watched the strain slowly wrap itself around one young heart, tightening gradually until she realized she was witnessing the beginning of an emotional wound that could deepen if left untouched. And she feared it was her fault, not because she was responsible, but because mothers always find a way to blame themselves. She described the late-night anxiety, the quiet tears behind closed doors, the sudden change in temperament, the questions no child should have to ask at such a young age. She admitted she had concealed how serious it had become because she feared palace advisors would insist on managing it rather than supporting it, turning a child's emotional struggle into a narrative problem. Her voice trembled, not out of weakness, but because love, deep maternal love, was finally demanding release. And William, who had built his public adulthood on the pillars of composure and future king steadiness, felt those pillars crack as he realized the full truth of what one of his children had been carrying. Catherine revealed how the pressure of royal life had begun affecting all the children, each in different ways, but one most intensely. She spoke about how the public appearances, the schooling environment, the constant awareness of their place in history, and the knowledge that even at their age they were expected to behave like symbols rather than simply children, had created an emotional landscape far heavier than any young mind should navigate. One child in particular, sensitive, thoughtful, and deeply affected by the world's gaze, was struggling with anxiety triggered by expectations they barely understood. Catherine had tried gentle support, quiet conversations, expert advice, and private adjustments, but nothing eased the tightening worry she saw in her child's eyes. Her guilt became the shadow that followed her every step. She blamed herself for raising them inside the demands of monarchy. She blamed the structure around them for refusing to bend. She blamed her own silence for letting it reach this point. And as she finally admitted all of this to William, she did so with a vulnerability few had ever seen in her, a mother terrified that she was watching a cycle she could not break. And William, listening, felt a familiar fear awaken, the fear that had lived inside him since boyhood, the fear of watching someone he loves be consumed by the pressures of a crown that promises stability but rarely offers protection. Institutional pressure only made everything heavier. The monarchy is built on emotional restraint. It teaches silence as survival. It values perception over expression, image over vulnerability. Catherine had felt the weight of those expectations for years, every smile measured, every gesture analyzed, every absence questioned. Advisors often reminded her of her role, stabilizer, symbol, steadfast presence beside the heir. They rarely asked how she felt beneath those expectations. And never once did they consider that children inside the palace walls might also need room to breathe. In the months leading to her confession, Catherine had felt trapped between two worlds, the world of a mother who wanted nothing more than to protect her children, and the world of a future queen who was expected to preserve the institution's image at all costs. The pressure wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive, it was subtle, suffocating, and constant. A suggestion here, a reminder there, a gentle push toward perfection that eroded her confidence day by day. She feared that admitting her child was struggling would be treated as a weakness, a vulnerability critics could exploit, and the palace might try to suppress. That fear kept her silent far longer than was healthy, until it became unbearable. When William heard Catherine's confession, the memories of Diana came rushing back with painful clarity. He remembered the emotional isolation she endured, the way the institution often failed to understand her, the way expectations crushed her spirit long before the world realized the damage. Catherine's words didn't just describe their child's struggle, they echoed Diana's emotional truth, resurrecting wounds William thought had healed. He saw in Catherine the same quiet desperation Diana had once carried. He saw in his child the same vulnerability he recognized in himself and Harry during their darkest childhood moments. And suddenly the walls of the palace, walls meant to protect them, felt like the very structure threatening their family's emotional well-being. It was this parallel, this collision of past and present, that triggered William's internal collapse. He tried to remain composed as Catherine spoke, but inside him something broke open. He felt terror, not for the crown, not for public perception, but for his child, for his wife, for the possibility that he had unknowingly allowed history to repeat itself. He realized that no matter how much he had promised himself he would be different from the generation before him, he had still allowed silence to take root. He felt guilt for not noticing sooner, shame for letting palace pressures cloud his attention, and grief for the childhood shadows that still shaped him more than he ever admitted. The palace reacted swiftly when whispers reached the upper floors. King Charles responded with a complicated blend of fatherly concern and monarchical caution. He understood pressure intimately, he had lived inside its grip for decades, but he also understood the danger of emotional vulnerability within the royal narrative. He worried that Catherine's confession, if ever leaked or mishandled, could destabilize public confidence, stir media speculation, and create Diana comparisons the institution was desperate to avoid. His instinct was to protect the monarchy first, even if his intention came from a place of care. Camilla, ever observant, viewed the situation through a different lens. She understood the risks, the media cycles, the critics waiting to pounce, the political consequences of perceived instability. But she wasn't cold to the emotional reality. She recognized Catherine's pain, acknowledged William's struggle, yet remained deeply aware of the monarchy's need for control. Her reaction was layered, complex, and tinged with the awareness that no matter how much empathy she offered, public narratives would always cast her as the villain should this crisis escalate. Inside the palace, tensions sharpened. Advisors debated behind closed doors, concerned less with emotional healing and more with narrative containment. Some urged transparency, believing the public would respond with compassion. Others warned that admitting emotional struggle within the Wales household could undermine royal authority, fuel anti-monarchy commentary, and invite damaging speculation. One faction insisted the family needed to present unwavering stability.
Another argued that authenticity could strengthen public trust. Quietly, subtly, the palace divided into two camps: those who wanted to support William and Catherine as a family, and those who wanted to protect the crown regardless of personal cost. But the truth doesn't stay hidden forever. When early whispers reached the press, framed vaguely, stripped of specifics, yet potent enough to spark curiosity, the public reaction was immediate. Social media exploded with hashtags, theories, emotional outpourings, and fierce debates. Many expressed deep sympathy for Catherine, praising her honesty and strength. Others speculated irresponsibly, twisting fragments of rumor into dramatic narratives. Royal commentators flooded talk shows with dissected possibilities. Tabloids crafted headlines designed to ignite clicks. Parents around the world voiced support for the children, relating to the pressures of modern childhood, even without royal expectations. The public did not distance themselves, they leaned closer, they cared. And with every message of concern, every opinion piece, every hashtag demanding answers, the pressure on William and Catherine multiplied. They found themselves trapped between emotional truth and public hunger, between the duty to shield their children and the demand to reassure a nation that had become intimately invested in their private pain. The world's concern was overwhelming but genuine. The institution's pressure was suffocating but predictable, and the family stood in the middle, pulled in both directions by forces far larger than themselves. As the emotional crescendo rose, William and Catherine reached a crossroads. They faced an impossible balance: protect their children's well-being or preserve the monarchy's carefully managed image. They were forced to confront the deepest, most painful question of their roles: are they parents first or symbols first? The strain carved itself into their private conversations, shaping their decisions, haunting their quiet moments. They loved their children fiercely, and yet their children lived inside a structure that demanded silence, composure, and perfection. William knew what this pressure could do. Catherine knew what prolonged emotional strain could become. They both realized that something had to change, not just within their household but within the institution itself. But change in monarchy moves slowly, cautiously, reluctantly, and every hour that passed intensified the urgency of their choice. They were no longer just the future king and queen. They were two parents fighting an invisible battle against a centuries-old system and a world watching too closely. And so the final question hangs in the air like a truth no one in the palace dares speak aloud. If the future king and queen cannot shield their own children from the weight of the crown, then who truly holds the power, the family, or the institution that demands their silence?